Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode here of the Historians Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today, this morning, is another guest that I had back on the show a year ago. Now, for those who remember, my guest today is a full-time government consultant, but it's always a history nerd. He lives in Vienna, Virginia with his daughter, whom he regularly tortures the double whammy of dad jokes and history jokes. He is the son of a history teacher, big surprise, and is originally from New York. He's a West Point graduate and Army veteran who served in Iraq as a tank platoon leader. However, he doesn't just like war books. His favorite subjects are the American Revolution, shipwrecks, and voyages of discovery, although you can talk to him pretty much just about anything and everything all at once. And in today's special episode, viewers and listeners, my guest and I will be diving into some of the most popular history books that have come out for 2025 and dive into the broader scholarship of all of these. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to returning guest, historian and historical content creator, Brendan Dowd. Brendan, welcome to the show.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me up back, Gabriel.
Awesome, Brendan. Awesome. I'm so excited to have you back on the show. Now, before we dive into today's topic, would you like to share with the viewers and listeners what you have been up to since the last time you were on the show a year ago?
Main thing, got married. That was a big one.
Nice. Congratulations.
Thank you. She is also a bit of a history nerd, although she will read a lot more fiction than I will, which isn't hard because basically reading one of your books was the only fiction I did in the past 6 months. So I stepped out of my comfort zone because I knew you would deliver, and it definitely happened. And then other than that, lots of reading, and as you know, just lots of social media and editing and all of that stuff.
Absolutely. And speaking of books, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, viewers and listeners, Brendan and I will be diving into some of the books that he has read for 2025 and dive into the greater scholarship. So, Brendan, would you like to show our viewers and listeners the books that we will be looking into in today's episode?
Absolutely. Let me grab the first one, which of course I put on the bottom by mistake. But the first one is going to be King of Kings.
Okay? Ooh.
It's the Iranian Revolution, a story of hubris, delusion, and catastrophic miscalculation. It's the Iranian Revolution, especially nowadays. Iran is in the news way more than we probably expected. But I was really lucky to get this book. It's by Scott Anderson, who's done some really fantastic work already on his previous books. But he dives into the Iranian Revolution, looking at different people within the story. And the complexity of the book is by far, it's the most complex book I've read so far this year. And when everyone who I'm going to bring up today, all the books, I either interview the author or have one set up as of right now so I can interview them. And I let Scott know right away. I said, I don't know how you made this book make sense because there's so many moving pieces. The Iranian Revolution didn't go the way as a lot of revolutions did, where there was this happened and this happened and this happened, and then you reach the crescendo and everything happens. There would be riots and then things would quiet down. There'd be more riots and things would quiet down. And then you have these amazing things in the Shah of Iran, who also went by the King of Kings. That was one of his titles. An autocratic ruler, completely totalitarian, and yet didn't like hurting people necessarily. He'd have his underlings do it, but he really wasn't the type that was go out and, start shooting into crowds. He was amazingly smart in certain ways, especially about weapon system and the oil industry, and then amazingly naive in other ways.
Fascinating.
And then you have the United States government, which of course you would expect does not come out fantastic in this particular narrative for different reasons than a lot of other times. Essentially, to paraphrase Scott, they had their heads in the sand because the Shah of Iran loved America at that point. He loved using us to get weapons and things of that nature. So a lot of the State Department folks that were in Iran were just saying, hey, everything's going great. We're great. The Shah's great. And it obviously turns out that that wasn't necessarily the case, that there was a lot of things going on within Iran, that it was a powder keg ready to explode, but it didn't all explode at once. And just building that narrative in this book, my head was spinning. I just didn't realize how many moving parts it had.
Fascinating. Yeah. And if you look at some pictures of Iran before the revolution, it is like a stark night and day in terms of how it is. And I actually remember going to the Nixon Museum and Library, and they had a whole wing dedicated to Iran before the revolution under the monarchy at the time. And it was just so incredibly eye-opening, because most people think of, like, you know, the history of Iran, they mainly think of after the revolution. But if you look at Iranian history pre-revolution, it was like one of the biggest tourist destinations in the world from the 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean, it was industrialized. It was one of like the major power plays of the Islamic world and the monarchy behind it. And again, I don't know if the book covers this, but I am very curious if they did touch on the whole possible conspiracy of like how the King of Iran got into power to begin with, how the U.S. kind of treated the monarchy at the time, their relationship, because for those that don't know, the United States and Iranian monarchy relationship at the time, and I am going to use this very loosely because my understanding of the history is very limited, it was 50-50 depending on how the day was. But it is really fascinating to look at it. And I definitely think for the scholarship, we don't really get a chance to see or learn much of Iran before that, because it is such a very interesting turning point, especially if you look at the grand scheme of that part of the world. Of the first Islamic nation modernizing was, of course, Turkey, and all the other nations wanted to follow suit. They wanted to follow Turkey's example because it was a very stable region. But it is just so fascinating. So, Brandon, what was probably the biggest surprise to you as a fellow historian that really kind of shook the foundations for you and possibly may have broken some myths you may have had about this period of history?
Well, Gabriel, you said it perfectly. Everything you just mentioned, Scott goes over it. I mean, if I had sent that to you before time, you couldn't have nailed it as much as you just did. There's what I looked at was, you see the Iranian Revolution, you see those pictures where it's, you know, women in mini skirts, and it just looks like basically California in the 1970s. And what Scott uncovers there is that's absolutely true in Tehran. As soon as you went outside the major cities, even around this time, it was much closer to a lot of Islamic beliefs. Women were completely covered. So what a lot of times what you see is just that pinhole of what Iran wanted to look like and wanted to tell the world it was like, but that was not necessarily how the entire nation was. The best way I can describe it is this was basically this huge palace built on decaying stone. It was there and it looked right from the right angle, but as soon as you looked at it a little bit differently, you realized that there was a tremendous amount of rot. And ultimately, what the Shah had to deal with right before the revolution, he was singularly terrible as a person to deal with, because to deal with this particular situation, because on the one hand, he kind of felt like everyone should just listen to him, and that's what you should do. But when it came to very difficult circumstances, he would get scared and almost literally run away. In fact, there are a couple of situations, especially with the American military, about how he came to power, where he literally ran away to a helicopter to another country. And that was the biggest eye-opening point for me, was how it got from those pictures that you talked about to what we know of as Iran now. And then realizing that, yes, those pictures were something, but it really didn't tell the whole story. And that was that type of life in Iran was living on borrowed time for a long time.
Fascinating. And just one last thing before I dive into the next book, I definitely think, again, the scholarship is important to discuss, Iranian history, especially to, as your point, it was, trying to present this image, which ultimately, externally the country was changing, or was, this fight between modernity and traditionalism. And I remember in a class that I had, which was, I believe it was called The History of the Islamic World from 1700 to the 20th century, you see how there's like this shift, this cultural shift, where many people now in the 20th century, and this is from my professor, says that, we're moving away from traditions. We have to reel back who we are, because we're becoming too much like Europe, becoming too much like the Americas. We have to, find out who we are. But I'm very, very certain that in the book that the author talked about how going in that direction was probably not the best way, or at least that outcome, unfortunately, was on the road, but possibly could have been altered if situations had gone differently, maybe 30 or 50 years prior. If things had been done a little bit differently, then perhaps Iran as we know it now may have been a very different Iran that would have gone in a very kind of this equilibrium balance of traditionalism, staying true to the history, but also wanting to be modernized and trying to find its footing on the world stage.
Yeah, and Scott goes over basically all of this oil money starts coming in, and and a lot of people did tell the Shah, you can't just throw the money out there. You have to have a plan. You have to control it. You have to make sure that everything you're talking about, that modernization, is done in a way to bring the whole country up. And, going back to the metaphor, he just kept building on the palace as opposed to making sure that the foundation was solid. And what I would say is the biggest thing that came from this is the revolution was not inevitable here. Whereas you look at something like the American Revolution, I believe that was something that was probably inevitable unless major things changed. I think with the Iranian Revolution, there was a lot of different ways that it didn't have to end the way it did, but history is history. That's what happened.
That is true. That is true. So, what is the next book that you've read that has also been a very big eye opener for you?
This one, as far as of all the books I had some semblance of understanding of it. This is the one where I went in knowing absolutely nothing. It blew me away. It's called A Flower Traveled in My Blood.
Ooh.
By Haley Cohen Gilliland, the incredible true story of the grandmothers who fought to find a stolen generation of children. So we're in Argentina now. We've jumped to a completely different part of the world.
Right.
And Argentina, I think a lot of people know Argentina has had a few political upheavals. And during one of the particular upheavals, there was basically death squads going around, grabbing any sort of rebels, resistance members against the government. And there's a lot more to it than that. So if anybody is screaming, it's not that simple, Brendan, with Argentina, yes, I totally understand, but we can't do a 6-hour podcast. You would kick me off. But what happened is a lot of these resistance members were women, and specifically pregnant women. And what came out is that these women were taken, they were allowed to give birth in these detention centers, then they were executed, and their babies were given away.
Oh my.
So decades later, the mothers / grandmothers of these women start to realize that, wait, there might be our grandchildren out there. So they were called the Abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, because of where they originally went to basically be seen, to do some sort of resistance, and to get word out there about what's happening. And they start to find their grandchildren. Some of them are a little bit older, some of them are a little bit younger. And this is basically the first half of the book, is just explaining all of these very complicated people and governments and what was happening. And what came out of that is some of the most just unbelievable moral questions. One of the first grandchildren that they find was taken from their mother. The mother was executed. They actually ended up with a family that had no idea that they were adopting a kidnapped child by the government. They adopted this child. They loved them. They didn't do anything wrong. And then because of the advent of DNA testing and being able to connect genealogically, they found this child in a different country. And they went and found out these people were really good people who raised the child. The child had been with them for quite a few years. And the child is like, this is my parents. I don't know who you are. I know you're saying you're my grandmother, but I don't know what you're talking about. These are my parents. And it comes to this really thorny moral question of, what do you do then? These people didn't do anything wrong. They adopted a child. They did everything right from a family perspective. And the abuelas then had to decide what to do. Do we pull this child from a loving home, or do we leave them where they're safe, they're happy? Is that the most important thing? That's the first huge moral question, because in a lot of these, people adopted or took these children and knew exactly where they came from. So it was much easier to say that these people are part of the problem, pull that child back so they can be raised amongst their families, so they can be loved. What then happens later in the book, the second thorny question that comes up is, you'll have people 22, 23, 24 years old who are identified, and you are the child of somebody who was murdered, taken from the government. And these people who don't necessarily know, they have an idea, they think this person is probably one of the missing grandchildren. And what they ran into was these 23, 24-year-olds were saying, I don't want to know. And it's not okay for you to force that information on me. So the court is sitting there going, we can't prove it yet because we have to do a DNA test, but this person is refusing a DNA test because they're saying, you're trying to blow up my life. I had great parents. They raised me, leave it alone. And that's kind of the back portion of the book, where I finished the book and I said, especially for these two questions, I don't know what the right answer is. It's all a right answer. It's all a wrong answer. I couldn't get it out of my head. Somebody being a grandmother who says this child was taken illegally. We need to make this right. Contrast that with adoptive parents who take a child in and love them, and then might have that child pulled away through no fault of their own. It's an absolutely heartbreaking book, but I learned just every page I was learning something new. And, I've never been to Argentina. I knew very little about the history. And just like with King of Kings, it's so complicated. And somehow she's able to write it in a way that even I could keep up. Like, I read a lot. Right. It doesn't mean I'm smart, people. Even I could keep up with all of the names.
Absolutely. And that, again, I did not know that part of Argentinian history. And it also raises another question, which is, oh boy.
Yep, sorry about that.
Brennan, can you still? Okay, you're back. There's a little black screen, but as I was saying, I could definitely see also another side that maybe it wasn't covered in the book, but it was definitely hinted, is that if these children, the 20, 30-year-olds, they did decide to get a DNA tested and it was proven, and they did learn that their biological parents were murdered by the government, that poses a new thing for the government. It's like, okay, are these children going to come back with a vengeance? There's going to be thousands of them. This is going to pose a significant problem if it comes up. Granted, probably the children are not even thinking of that, or maybe they are, but they're like, I don't want to know what's happening. And that's this huge dilemma. It's like, do you want to know where you came from, or do you not want to know because you probably have seen it? Even if you were a child growing up in an adoptive household, more than likely you probably still would have seen the violence that was happening around the countryside. You probably would have heard about it on the news. Your parents, your adoptive parents, would have most likely heard it. They would have seen it. The newspapers would have detailed it. So in their best way, trying to make sure the child did not see that as best they could. And again, this is a very complex, delicate issue. I mean, you want to do right by this kid, these children, but do you care for them and love them enough to let them go? That the only way for them to truly be safe is that you do not get involved in their life.
Yeah, and it's a question of justice versus rights. Do you have the right not to know? And if your right to not know is going to keep someone from being brought to justice, where is that trade-off? And it's just a perfect example of when people talk about, I think, generational trauma, they're kind of like, I don't know what that means. This is generational trauma, that decades ago somebody did something and there is still horrible things being visited on people decades later.
Absolutely. And this could be brought into cover like a bunch of other topics that focus on children who were adopted by other people. You can look at here in the United States with the boarding schools of indigenous children being taken from their homes, sometimes being adopted into non-indigenous families, and the trauma that they've endured. Because let's be honest, viewers and listeners, there's a lot of scholarship on what happened in those boarding schools, and that could be applied to anywhere else in the world. So this topic, I think, is really, really important in that regard. But again, this particular issue, which is rights versus morals, there is no right answer to this. You just have to go by a case-by-case basis. And before we go on to the next book, one little curious question, Brendan, was there a particular case or story that was mentioned by the author that was really kind of like the kindling for this huge debate of, do we bring the children into their real families, or we just let them stay with the families that took them in?
Well, the very first one that she reports on, that Haley reports on, is, and we talked about, the child was younger. I maybe 6 or 7 years old. I may be wrong on the age when the child is identified, taken in by parents who did not know, were great. And ultimately, the grandmother is not a spoiler. It's halfway through the book, but it'll actually kind of make your day a little bit better. The grandmother goes, meets these people, and realizes that they're good people, that they're raising this child well. The child is loved. And so she actually decides to let the child stay there. And then on top of that, the adoptive parents said, we're going to make sure that you're part of this family. And so that the child stays where he or she was, gets to be brought up by these good people, but these good people then also realize that this grandmother was making a huge sacrifice. And they made sure to pull her in, make her part of the family. And for, the following decades, they became very close so that this grandmother can still be part of raising this child. But in other cases, it wasn't like that. And that was kind of that first test case where it turned out great. But after that, a lot of them did not. And it really kind of depended on who adopted the child. Did they know where the kid came from? Or were they completely in the dark? And it goes a lot of different ways because there were so many cases of this happening.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, very powerful discussion. Definitely this huge scholarship could be explored into other avenues, other topics across the world, which, again, reason why I love this episode in particular, viewers and listeners, because there's so much other scholarship to really explore in the field of history. So keeping the train going, Brendan, what is the next book that you've read that really, really pushed you and really made you think outside the box as an historian?
The next one is Race Against Terror. I don't physically have one. Sorry, everybody. The book's not out yet. It's Chasing an Al-Qaeda Killer at the Dawn of the Forever War by Jake Tapper. And Jake Tapper, everyone knows he just had that Biden book come out. Everybody was talking about it. He actually was working on this book, I think, for at least 10 years or something like that. And that's coming out as well, which, if you talk to an author, right, it takes forever to put a book out. To put two books out in 1 year is insane. But this is about an al-Qaeda terrorist who goes to Afghanistan, kills American soldiers in combat. Later on, leaves Afghanistan, bounces around, various things happen. He ends up in an Italian courtroom where he's telling everyone around him, I'll go to the US, I don't care. I killed American soldiers. Let's go. I'm ready to talk. And it breaks down that it's so bizarre. I know that sounds so bizarre as a setup, but that's legitimately like the first 10 pages.
Wow.
And so the American government goes to Italy and they're trying to get him out because they start looking into him. He seems very dangerous. He seems not like just a guy who's running around firing off a rifle. He's ready to do some big things, and he's not scared of dying for what he believes. And the U.S. government has to go to Italy, somehow get him out of Italy. Italy's like, we know what you're going to do with the terrorists, so we're not going to give him to you because you're not just going to throw him in Guantanamo and do this. And they ultimately do kind of figure out, otherwise the book would be very short, how to get him back to the U.S. But this gave me a lot to think about, Gabriel, because it comes down to the fact of we're not quite sure how to deal with terrorists. You take torture off the table. I know there's a lot of discussion about that, but when you take that completely off the table, how do you deal with a terrorist? Can you just put them in the American criminal justice system and put them through a trial? If they are the type of person that is so dangerous, that has plans, that has connections, that if given the ability to even talk to people might be dangerous to the American public, what do you do? And that is the scenario that Tapper breaks down in this, which is that you, like I said, take torture, which to me is very black and white. I am a former American soldier, like I know. But when you take that off the table and you're just suddenly like, hey, he killed soldiers on a battlefield. It's war. How do you deal with that? He didn't have a country, though. He wasn't part of a country that waged war on the United States, which then you have the Geneva Conventions. But at the same time, dropping him into, a DC courtroom saying you're guilty of murder, do we have the tools to deal with that kind of situation? And it builds a lot from there. It asks a lot of questions. And I know a lot of what we just talked about, the United States right now is very divided across lines. And I think Tapper just does an excellent job because he doesn't take sides. He says you have to see that, just putting him in a regular courtroom is very risky, and maybe there aren't the tools to deal with it. And it allows for a much deeper discussion. And just like with the book I talked about right before that, some uncomfortable questions where you're stuck with a lot of answers that partially feel wrong and partially feel right, and where you're going to go from there.
Absolutely. And it actually sounds very much like if this was adapted into a screenplay and into because this is a true story, correct? This is
Yes.
based on true story. I could see this as a legal courtroom drama movie where you literally have the terrorist who's like the main figure, the central character in this story. And you have this huge legal battle. It's like, okay, as you said, Brennan, if we were to extradite him back to the U.S., but we couldn't send him to Guantanamo Bay, well, what do we do? And I remember there's a lot of books that talk about trying soldiers for killing other soldiers in war, but it's like, is that technically murder in the legal sense? Because it is war. They are enemy combatants. But in this regard, since he wasn't flying under a nation's flag, and instead he was flying for an organization's flag, does that still fall under the same judicial legal parameters? If not, do we send him to The Hague to be tried as a war criminal? But then that brings up another question. If that's the case, then we would get everyone who is a terrorist or is affiliated with a terrorist organization sent to The Hague. So that does provide a very interesting dynamic. And yes, that is a very engaging and thought-provoking story. It's like, what do you do? Because it does bring up some uncomfortable topics, like, what do we do with this person? Like, if we do the wrong thing, it's going to set a precedent for other situations to arrive. Do we leave him in Italy to be tried with them? But how is Italy going to really handle him? Are they going to do due diligence? So I could definitely see this being a huge topic into the whole political structure of the United States in this regard, and other books that deal with post 2001 of how we have dealt with terrorizations over the years, and other books that dive into it.
And it's that eternal question of how much freedom do you want if you have to give up a lot of security? How much security do you want because you're going to lose freedom? You can't have both. Yes. Absolute. And the other part of Tapper's book that I really appreciate is being a combat veteran. When I read books where authors try and sound military, very often it goes wrong. They either overdo it and they're just using too much jargon. You're sitting there, we don't talk like that. That's not how we do it. This book, Tapper does one of the best jobs I've ever seen of using our vernacular, but not overusing it. And understanding that, we don't do speeches every day before you go into combat. Sometimes it's like you wake up, you have your coffee, you get on your vehicle and you go. And he seems to kind of understand that you don't have to make everybody a hero every second of the day. That, one particular soldier that he talks about, he was a little bit of a screw up, and he kind of knew he was a little bit of a screw up. And he said, all right, let me join the military. Let me get myself together and do that. And it's an essential part of the book because he certainly does not make the terrorist anything other than he is. He's a murderer. It's really not a question about that. But the American soldiers he allows to be heroes within the book without, I'm going to say the word wrong, mythologizing them and making them these amazing heroes that do nothing wrong. That's not how humans are, and it's not how it works.
Fascinating. And this book could be a whole dive in of itself in one episode. And honestly, I may actually call you back, Brendan, for just focusing on this book with also a fellow historian, because we could spend hours on this one.
Yes, absolutely. And as of today, when we are recording, I'll be talking to Jake hopefully next Thursday. So I'll get to ask him a couple questions too.
Nice. So after that book, what was the next one that you've read that really, really touched you?
Okay, next one, again, not out just yet. Deadwood, Gold, Guns, and Greed in the American West by Peter Cousins.
Ooh, all right.
Yes. Now, one thing I love is, first of all, the TV show Deadwood. If you have not seen it, you need to see it. It's right. Don't have the kids in the room when you do, but definitely watch the series. And what I love about this book is Peter starts off talking about the show. And he says himself, I love the show. It's one of the reasons I wanted to dig in and really kind of see what really happened. And of course, Deadwood, the series, is, there's quite a bit of fiction around it. What I found absolutely shocking is not as much fiction as you think.
Really?
The people in the show, for the most part, were there. Seth Bullock, Al Swearingen, they were there. And a lot of these things that are in the series did kind of happen. Of course, they added some this, changed these things around. But what Peter does best with this one is he explains how quickly Deadwood became a town and how people were going into the hills. And first of all, just everything, of course, done to the indigenous Americans at this point in time. And people were streaming in, and it was just very funny that, we found gold over here. All of a sudden, there's a town there the next day. Somebody put up a bunch of tents. A month later, all of a sudden, the first house goes up. 6 months later, there's 5,000 people there trying to get gold. And then they realize there isn't that much gold. But we found one 10 miles up the road, and all of a sudden, the entire town moves there. And the way this migration happened and the speed at which it happened, like Deadwood can't happen in most other places. This was a special for good and bad time in the country where a town cannot exist the day before and then all of a sudden it's there. And Swearingen was not a good guy. Seth Bullock was a good guy, but there was a ton of politics. And it was really, really cool to get the truth around it and hear it, but then also have everything that he added. The thing that I found absolutely amazing, Deadwood was not really racist. And you think Wild West towns, you think about this time period, and there would be racial problems. But especially if you were a non-white American, Deadwood was one of the best places to go. You were allowed to just, if you're going to be there and you're going to do your thing and you're going to be a good citizen, you're going to be treated way better in Deadwood than most other American cities at this time. That part blew my mind. Just you don't think about it and you're just thinking, oh, it will be so easy. And for the most part, it was, no, we just want to keep the town clean. And if you're going to be a good citizen, you're going to get left alone. Not nearly as much gunplay as I expected, though. I wish there was more.
Fascinating. And I like how, you brought up a topic of the American West, because I definitely think when we think of the American West in terms of historical scholarship, especially the towns, you don't really see a lot of those because, of course, everyone thinks of Kansas City, Tombstone, Los Angeles, Paso, Texas. But each of those towns in the American West during this time is vastly different. Vastly, vastly different. And even going media route, like the depictions of the American West, most people think, oh, the American West wasn't grimy, it wasn't dirty, it wasn't filthy. Well, you do have to think of, okay, what city or what town are you referring to in the American West and what time period? Because the American West is vastly different. Case in point, if you look at American primeval, that was during a period in American history where you had the United States government facing the Mormon militia. And anyone who knows that history, that was not a peaceful encounter. It was a very violent exchange of blows. In fact, there was probably most people may not know this, but the Mormon massacre, which the Mormon militia attacked and killed almost close to 100, if not more, settlers that were trying to establish themselves in that new territory. And then, of course, as Brennan brought up, these border towns and these small communities were brought up because, oh, there's some wealth there. There's either gold, there's either land, or at the very least, there's water. And in some cases, that belonged to the indigenous nation or indigenous tribe that resided in that territory. And as we all know in history, the U.S. and the settlers generally did not have a amicable relationship with the indigenous people. It was often very bloody. Situations were brought about to get said land, as of course, a case of the Black Hills and stuff like that. But going back to this discussion of these border towns and these Western communities, it is very fascinating that it shows, what really the West was like from a different perspective, as well as geographically speaking, how diverse these towns were, again, depending on where these were located and what the day-to-day life was like. That we don't want problems. If you're a good citizen, then you're going to get along very nicely in here. Are there going to be gunfights? Yes, but not to the extreme that we have seen in media. There's not a gunfight every 5 minutes when you're walking to town, then someone's being thrown out of the bar and it's boom, boom. No. Were there those on occasion? Absolutely, because people are flawed. There are going to be disagreements. But ultimately, I like how you mentioned this book and how it kind of sheds light on what these towns were like and kind of breaking, in a way, the mythology, the mythos that people have of the American West.
And especially you watch the show, it's a fantastic show. It doesn't ruin it in any way. But I always find when you get even a 300-page book, it can just do so much more
Hmm.
for you when you're learning about these people, and you get to. It's what I love about history is that you can't cut corners. Somebody is who they are, and they perform the actions that they did. So, in a TV show with fiction, you can make somebody one thing one day, and the next day they're different. And humans are not like that, which means when you go back and you're an author and you're a historian digging into this, people will do crazy stuff, and you have to sit there and say, but why? Because he wasn't trying to help me with the plot. He made a decision, and why did he do that? And that's uh, this is a great one for that, just kind of understanding why it all happened and how it happened.
Absolutely. And one last tip before we go on to the next book, I definitely think the American West is definitely getting a resurgence in scholarship. There's a lot more people looking into the West, especially because, media has been trying to do its best to showcase what the West was like, getting more historians involved. And I definitely think that was in due in part to, of course, the Yellowstone prequel series 1883, which showcased probably the most accurate depiction of the American West at that time, from the settlers, towns, traveling, and how everything was like. And you can even say, the American West in the 1920s, that it was like the last bastion of this ideal of what it meant to be living off the land and being so cut off from modern society, but it's this blend of the two. And you can even say that Deadwood and many other towns were showcasing how there was a shift in trying not to be like the cities of the East, but you knew that in order for these towns to survive, they had to grow, they had to modernize, but they wanted to go at their own pace and still retain some semblance of identity that's not New York, that's not Chicago, it's not Boston, because Boston was probably the biggest city that a lot of people did not want to emulate. I know people have a thing of like New York that that's like the big city, but in some cases it was Boston. Boston, New York, and Chicago were the big ones that people moved away from and wanted to start new.
And especially along with everything you just said is that the independence, that if
Yeah.
you are in one of these big cities, a lady history nerd, my wife loves watching the Gilded Age, and you see like that
Yes.
there's that this is who you are, and to move up and all that stuff. Deadwood, nobody cares who you were in Deadwood. If you
No.
found the gold, that was your gold, and you can be kind of a mover and a shaker. So the independence part was capitalism first, but independence was always a huge part of that, especially in the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what were the next books that you've uncovered, Brennan?
All right, next one, Thomas More, A Life,
Ah, yes.
Joanne Paul. This one I love. Thomas More is I am Catholic. I have some very complicated feelings about the Catholic Church. I think a lot of people do. But Thomas More is kind of one of my favorite characters. You've seen him in so many different things, for a lot of times the beheading, but for a lot of other reasons as well. And I've read multiple biographies on him, but this one I particularly love because Joanne kind of digs in more to his exact feelings and what they meant. For a lot of people, you look back at Thomas More, and he's either a saint or a murderous zealot. And of course, with anything else, it's never that simple. And Joanne really kind of digs into that. And I love Thomas More because, first of all, he's very funny. And even reading some of the things he said now, they're still funny. And then you have something like Utopia, which I had tried to read. I wanted to think I was very fancy and very smart, and read it and said, I don't know what he's doing. I can't get it. This is too smart for me to put it down. But having Joanne explain all of these things, what it meant and what he actually thought, it was really, really eye-opening. I think the biggest thing is that she pulled up these letters where Thomas More even said, yeah, I don't really agree with what the Pope is saying right now. And I think that the men running the church can make huge mistakes, and we don't necessarily have to follow them when they are making those mistakes, which just kind of throws everything on its head when you say he's just a crazy zealot. And if you weren't Catholic, he was trying to burn you at the stake. And it throws it on its head because, he wasn't a complete zealot who was so smart in one aspect and then just completely shut his brain off when it came to religion. And that was huge for me to read that and be like, oh, that really changes it. Now, of course, we can't get around the fact that he did have heretics burned at the stake. And you have to look at that and kind of see like this person who in a lot of ways was able to intellectually go through these thought processes would still end up at a place where he's going to light other human beings on fire. And even with that, Joanne kind of breaks down that he was part of a system that did that, not excusing it, but also kind of pointing out that it was not like this was his sole thing and he was running out there finding people himself and, lighting the fire, but part of a system that was already pushing those things through. It was just eye-opening in a lot of ways because she treated him as a human being she was trying to figure out. And right. I think there was so much more nuance than when I've seen him treated in other places.
Absolutely. And I think for those that aren't very astute in at least the Tudor history, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brennan, but Thomas More was also like the head of Henry VIII's infamous Wolf Hall politics, correct?
Yes. So, if you watch Wolf Hall, if you watch the Tudors, Thomas More is a huge part of that. I think in Wolf Hall, I have not seen Wolf Hall. My wife has. I think in Wolf Hall, it picks up right after he's been executed, perhaps. I'm sure somebody in the comment section will correct us if we are wrong. But yes, when you're talking about the Tudor dynamics, this was huge. Henry VIII, he was the head of his government, and then he was executed for various reasons, but mostly for basically refusing to say that Henry was the head of the English church in the Catholic Church. And that was something else that Joanne breaks down, the legalese that they were fighting through. And it was very, very interesting to see the amount of people that were More's enemies who did not want him executed, either because they felt it was wrong or because they thought we're going to make a martyr out of him as opposed to getting what we need. And very often it was a mixture of the both, that they didn't have anything against him, but they knew they had to uphold what Henry VIII wanted. And what really comes out of this, and I've said this on a couple of podcast episodes, I don't think we point out just how much Henry VIII sucked. He was such a terrible human being, and I think sometimes there's a romantic aspect to him that I think gets a bit overdone when he was really a megalomaniac, and a lot of other words that I'm not going to use on here, but people can fill in the gaps on that.
Absolutely. And you also look at his relationship with, because if I'm not mistaken, Thomas More was a very close advisor and the second most powerful person in England at the time, before, of course, his and Henry's relationship became very, very strained. And you see this precedent, especially now with Thomas More. We're going to have a tangent a bit, but tying it into, the political Tudor dynamics is, of course, the great famous Catholic lawyer who was truly Henry VIII's closest friend. And for those who know what I'm talking about, he was made an example by Henry VIII's inner circle, or as you would call it, the cabal, who wanted him dead because they viewed him as a traitor. And why was he branded a traitor? Because he did not sign off on the marriage of Henry VIII and his newest wife when he divorced Captain of Aragon and wanted to establish himself as the head of the new church. That was something that this gentleman was not going to agree to. And a lot of people, as Brennan said, wanted him dead. They absolutely wanted him dead because, A, this guy was very powerful. He was before Thomas More. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Thomas More may have played a role in that, either trying to get him to say, just agree to it, just say that you agree to the marriage and you can be spared. You'll be in the Tower of London for the rest of your life, but you'll be alive. But the gentleman was like, no, I'm not going to do it because that's the reason why you guys are going after me. It's not because, oh, I have issues against the king, or I say the king is not the head of the church. That's none of those things. You are going after me because I would not sign off on the new marriage. And that, again, that's a discussion you can have for another thing. But going back to Thomas More, he did what he thought was right. And you could argue, was that for the benefit of the king, or was that for his own political rise? You can make an argument for both. But ultimately, again, as you said, Brian, when Thomas More did face his own comeuppance at the end, it's like, yes, people hated him, but they didn't want him dead because, again, he's a very powerful man. He's a very influential figure in Tudor politics. What's going to be the fallout if we go through with this? How is the country going to react?
And my favorite anecdote, I don't remember which French king, but the French king at this particular point in time, More is executed. And even the French king is like, I wouldn't have done that. And he said, to paraphrase, if I had someone like that in my court, I would treasure them, right? As this intellectual who could always see ways around things and could, especially from a legal perspective, he was an amazing lawyer in a lot of ways. He was one of just the smartest people at that time. And even the French king decided, to just kind of needle Henry VIII and just be like, I would have treated my people a lot better when they're that smart. But that's what happens.
Absolutely. And again, the Tudors and the history, I definitely feel the Tudors in themselves are probably the one scarf to that's probably been too much, specifically around Henry VIII and his wives. But I will admit, you can make the argument that you can look at the people of the Tudor world, like the lesser known families of Tudor England, Thomas More, many others, and see how the Tudor politics shaped them. And we're almost nearing the end of this incredible discussion. So to make sure we get through all the books, what are the next two books that you've uncovered?
Okay. We can do this one a little bit faster. The Aviator and the Showman.
Ooh, all right.
Laurie Gwen Shapiro, Amelie Earhart, George Putnam, and the Marriage That Made an American Icon. This is another one where Laurie does such a great job of taking Amelia Earhart and telling the whole story about her. And it's very easy, like with Thomas More, like with a lot of people that we talked about, she was a hero. Oh, no, she was just a passenger on a flight. She actually was a terrible pilot. She was manipulative. She was naive. She was passionate. She was nice. She was all of those things. And Laurie digs into that. It's the most amazing thing about Amelia is, from a piloting perspective, she was not that great a pilot. A lot of people weren't then because it was still a generally new thing, but there were multiple women pilots who were significantly better from a technical perspective. Amelia was basically, for her big cross the ocean, she was recruited for it by George Putnam, who would end up becoming her husband later on. And she was an extremely complex person. Laurie digs into places where she's kind of manipulative, and she sets up George, and George Putnam was not a nice guy, but he seemed to really love Amelia. And he was the heavy for her, where if there was something uncomfortable, something that people weren't going to like, he took the hit for that. At the same time, you see people around Amelia who were better pilots, who maybe are jealous of something. Every single one of them walked away. Anyone who talked to Amelia said, she was so nice. I really like her as a person. And it's that crazy juxtaposition of there's people who shouldn't like her, but nobody can walk away from her without having a pleasant experience. And George Putnam is a lot more complicated, very manipulative, very controlling of Amelia. And, Amelia has this strain of feminism that really tested some boundaries around this time. And it's very, very difficult to read this book without seeing all of the gray and seeing all of Amelia. I found as a character in history, I'm much more impressed by her because Laurie highlighted everything about her. It wasn't just one thing. She could be all these different things at once.
Absolutely. And the thing I will say to that before going to the next book is that it seems to me that she is trying to kind of not break it, but shed more light on Amelia, that she was more than just the woman who circumvented the world. That this is a woman at this time who knew what she wanted. And you can also argue that she probably created a persona because she was getting popular. She was being featured more often at that time. And yes, as you said, Brandon, that, from a technical standpoint, she probably was not the best pilot, but also to think of, well, look at the planes that they were flying around the time. They're not like the high-tech aircrafts we have now. We have to think of the technology. But it does seem to me that this and many other books that we've covered thus far, the authors are trying to show the whole picture, not take either side of the individual or individuals or event, but try to show history as accurate as possible and authentic as possible. Even if that means, showcasing a character that we've immortalized as this in history, but in truth, showing that, they had their moments of flawed, that they were sometimes not the heroes, in some cases have a little villainous streak to them. Does that destroy who they are as we remember them to be? No, it just adds a little bit more layers to their personality.
Yeah, I think if you are a historian and you're expecting people to be just one thing, you will be disappointed every single time. People just are not that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Except maybe a little bit like the next guy we're about to talk about. Murderland.
Ooh.
So Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers by Caroline Fraser. So I'll do, and actually we want to keep this short because I don't want to give too much away. Okay. Ted Bundy is on the front of the cover, but he's not the only one covered. And Caroline goes about this book. It's a lot of different pieces that she pulls together. So I could see a lot of people saying, oh, she's jumping around a lot. It's part of the plan. And what I tell everyone for this book is you go in there for true crime, you're going to end up a lot more than you think. And at the heart of this book is what's called the lead crime hypothesis. And the very short is that there are certain things like lead and gasoline that became very popular. And it just so happened that when lead was at most in the atmosphere, there was a huge surge in the amount of serial killers in the United States. And it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't mean that if you're around lead, you're going to be a serial killer. But there is a very strong and strange correlation between the amount of lead in the air and serial killers. And what Caroline does is she doesn't dig in and start talking about the science of it. She starts using different serial killers in different areas and starts pointing out that, oh, hey, by the way, Ted Bundy, for instance, lived downwind of some smokestacks that were putting a lot of different chemicals in the air, including lead. And no, it doesn't mean that he was destined to be a serial killer, but there's a bit too many numbers to kind of just completely forget about it.
Absolutely. And I could definitely say, again, I don't want to give too many spoilers for this because I actually have heard of this book as well, that you could definitely make the argument that this book could have gone the way of conspiracy theory from, the lead theory. But I do like how the author doesn't go down that direction. But as you said, definitely makes a correlation that there's too many coincidences of, all of these figures, because there are more than one. There's more than one in this book. But yeah, to your point, you're looking for true crime, you're going to get a lot more than you bargained for. It is not easy to read in terms of, the content. You are going to be uncomfortable because it is a topic that will make you uncomfortable. And I think that is the point. And hopefully what I will say before we go on to the next book is that it definitely tries to, because there's a lot of dramas on serial killers and crime shows, they tend to either mythologize or, in a way, kind of fantasize. Again, don't know why that always is the case with either crime dramas or stuff like that. But what I do appreciate about the author, she does not shy away from who these evil people are, and I really do appreciate that.
100%, totally agree. Okay, let's go a little bit lighter for the next one.
All right.
Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age by Eleanor Baraklov. It's a fantastic book. First of all, Eleanor, follow Eleanor on Instagram, everybody. Her videos are epic. There are Legos and Vikings involved. I will leave it there. You can just go find it yourself. Trust me. Also, one of the easiest interviews I've ever had in my life. I just needed to ask a question, and she was so excited about talking about everything in the book. She was so excited to just talk about everything. Like, she was, you know how it is. You ask the question, that person takes it and just takes it to the house, and you're like, I barely even need to be here. But the book is focused on looking at archaeological Viking relics and looking at the everyday Viking. So you write Ragnar, everybody knows Ragnar. Here's the story. She tries to go as far away from that as possible. What was it like to be a Viking? One of my most favorite things of all time, it's right in the beginning. I'm not going to tell you the exact wording because you need to read it yourself. But they basically found a piece of wood that was definitely probably given to some guy in a bar that said, "Come home, it's late." And Eleanor can't say for sure that that's what happened, but she found it and said, well, you can extrapolate that this was basically saying, Ivar, it's late, come home from the bar. And there's all of these things in there. And I'm personally, for somebody, archaeology, I like having characters, so archaeology can sometimes be a little bit slog for me. This one nails it, absolutely nails it. And it's so much fun, and I learned so much. And, Vikings. Who doesn't like hearing about Vikings?
And one thing I will say to that is, from what you told me, it definitely does sort of break, again, probably one group that has the most myths about them is, of course, the Vikings. But add to that, Vikings ate better than most people on the continent of Europe as well as Great Britain. And Vikings were not just, an ethnic group of people that we sometimes correlate the Scandinavian nations. It was more of a term to refer to raiders. And that referred to a lot of others, which included the Balkan Vikings from the Baltic Sea. And also, Vikinger, going a Viking, was a phrase. So I definitely like how there is an author that is shedding the light on the everyday people. And again, these people ate better. Homes were not as what we've seen depicted in media. They were not dark gray wearing clothing. They were very colorful, very bright. And also, not every Viking had a sword. If you had a sword, you were wealthy. Majority of times, you had an axe or spear.
And what almost, it seems like, based upon the archaeological evidence, something that almost every Viking had was a comb. They took care of their hair. So it's like dirty, matted hair Vikings. Nah, they loved their hair. They took care of it.
Absolutely. So, Brennan, we're almost nearing the end. What are the next few books that you have that you'd like to share?
We got one more. I don't physically have this one. It's called Kuleana, a story of family, land, and legacy in old Hawaii by Sarah Go.
Ooh, okay.
So, especially we're over time, so I'll go through it real fast. Basically, Sarah's family had inherited land that was given to them by a Hawaiian king. Obviously, before the United States went ahead and decided that Hawaii didn't want to be independent anymore. But this land getting passed down is becoming very complicated. There's a lot of billionaires going into Hawaii, buying up land. And right now, the Hawaiian culture is, in a certain way, kind of under attack. That many Hawaiians can't afford real estate. Anybody who's been out to Hawaii on any of the island will know exactly what I'm talking about. And she just tells a story about how she wants to connect more to her Hawaiian culture. She was not born there, but she had family there. And it's really a great book for anybody who has a lineage or, a hereditary attachment to something like I'm Irish American, right? But I'm really American. I never lived in Ireland, but that heritage of mine is very important to who I am as a person. And anybody can kind of, tap into that. And she really taps into that in this book. And part of it is about, hey, this is what's happening in Hawaii. We all know what happened in Maui very recently with the wildfires and why those things happened. And it's just a great story about something that's very specific to Sarah, but that most people will understand, where there's something that you want a more spiritual connection to that maybe you don't have the physical connection to all the time.
Absolutely. And the last thing I will say for that book, viewers and listeners, it almost gives me the mindset of, like, the Yellowstone shows that we've seen, like, this family trying to preserve their heritage. Because Brent's absolutely right. At the time when Hawaii was kind of forcibly put into the state of territory to official state of the United States, land was being bought up. You had plantations that were being transformed, which then led to immigrants being brought in to cultivate the land. And again, the Hawaiian culture was gradually being erased. And there are many stories like these all across the world of families trying to preserve their heritage, their culture, in the face of, as the billionaires would say, you're an enemy of progress or of change. But we can also look at this in a way of saying, well, is it kind of getting in the way of progress, or is it more of getting in the way of your interests? Because that's a whole discussion in of itself. And there is one other book, I don't remember the name, but it talked about how after the Spanish-American War, when the United States owned Cuba, spoilers for people who don't know that, yes, the United States did occupy Cuba for a good many years before we were kicked out. We were trying to cultivate the exact same thing. We were trying to make it into a territory. Obviously, that did not pan out to our benefit, but that did happen. So Hawaii, Cuba, a lot of other lands and islands in the Caribbean and many other places went through similar instances. And all of these books can be talked about in future episodes for their own individual ones. But as a note, I like to leave it here, viewers and listeners, all the things we talked about, they all contribute to the scholarship of history for new avenues, new explorations, new perspectives. And I think Brent and I can both agree is that in the field of history, it needs to be adaptive. It needs to show other sides, because history is not written by the victor. Sometimes history is written by everyday people. And unfortunately, those average individual people get snuffed out by the bigger voices.
Agree. And Gabriel, I should just say this because I'm sure someone's going to realize it. We said 10, we did 9. I didn't scroll down far enough. Monsterland, A Journey Around the World's Dark Imagination by Nick Jubber. It's about the history of all of the favorite monsters that you ever known of, vampires, werewolves, where they came from. Sorry, everybody. That's my fault. I didn't scroll down. That book's fantastic. That's all you need to know. Go ahead, get it.
And I'll also make a little side note to that. If you actually want to know a little bit more about, the monsters and the myths of Americas as well as the world, I'll make sure to tag my interview with a great and talented historian as well as folklorist whose whole background is about monsters and myths in America and in the world. And if you'd like to see more of these books, I'll be attaching them down below. And Brendan, before we officially end, again, thank you so much for coming back on the show. I really do appreciate it. And where can people find you on social media if they want to connect with you and you have any announcements for any upcoming episodes or interviews on your show?
Well, you can find me, History Nerds United. We got the blog, we got the podcast. So it's not just the podcast. That's on everywhere you can find it, Spotify, Apple. You can also go to our blog, History Nerds United. That's where I do all of my book reviews. Interviews coming up. I have the 9th great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Captain William Kidd is coming on to talk about how for lack of a better term, his ancestor was screwed over. Some of the people that we talked about, I have John Bacon coming on to talk about the Edmund Fitzgerald, for those who know about that one. Jake Tapper, and I'm currently trying to lock down Pulitzer Prize winner Gilbert King, who has a new true crime book coming out. And yeah, I mean, there is, and I think I can say it now, the very last episode of the year on 12/17, for everyone looking for that person in their life that is impossible to buy for. If they are a whiskey lover, we are doing a history of whiskey episode with the author who wrote the Whiskey Bible that will be out soon. So 12/17, if you don't like history but you love whiskey, that one's for you.
Awesome. I'll link all that down below in the description of this video. And if you want to see Brennan's first interview on the show, I'll also link it here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of the Historians Lounge here on the show. Big thank you to Brennan for coming back on the show and showing us all the books that he's read and many more, which, again, if you would like to see those books, I will tag them down below. And if you'd like to see one of those books be turned into an episode, comment down below as well which book you would like to see in a full-length episode. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all in the next episode.